Hello everyone, I'm Wave, and today I wanted to talk about a visual novel that I finished reading not too long ago, being Akai Ito HD. This is a game that to some call the Dark Souls of visual novels, but also to a great number of people is the game that has an absolutely terrible official translation. Today I'm going to be talking about all these things, so let's get into it. To my knowledge, Akai Ito was a pretty cult classic PS2 visual novel that later got an HD release onto Steam, and with it came a pretty lackluster translation, but we can go ahead and talk about that a little bit later. Talking about the game in general, people consider it the Dark Souls of visual novels, and I guess that's why, because this game has a whole number of different endings. There are 32 different endings and is pretty much based around the thought of the butterfly effect, to where there's 3 main branches for the story, and any one choice can lead to vastly different ways for the story to play out. This is a game that you could probably burn through quite fast if you were to use a walkthrough, but for me personally, I played through it blind for most of my playthrough, and then when I eventually got to the point where I had felt like I had gone through as many choices as I had without having to go around and do very specific things, that was when I used a walkthrough for cleanup. I think this game actually works quite well with a blind playthrough, because the fact that you actually have a flow chart that shows you all of the different branches, and you're able to see any of those points that jut out, to where you can look on the tree and see this is the juncture where I didn't choose this choice, so you can go back in and go ahead and see what that would result in when it comes to story wise. Now, I don't actually think the game is the quote unquote Dark Souls of visual novels. It's a game where I guess you can die quite a number of times, but from what I was actually playing, there's 32 endings in total, and I want to say after the first 10 endings or so, you're gonna start to slow down. You're not gonna actually really quickly grab different endings in just rapid succession, but also that there isn't really that many death endings, and then also it's not too easy to get onto a lot of death endings. Sometimes I was trying to do specific choices to get a death ending, and ended up actually taking me somewhere else that I didn't expect to go. And then also when it comes to endings, I know there has actually been some relevance when it comes to other visual novels that have been coming out, where maybe Akai Ito doesn't have 100 endings, but there is still kind of the question of, do some of the endings get repetitive? I would say that there is a decent amount of endings, maybe I almost want to say maybe only 4 or 5 that are instances to where you can, in some sort of horror story, you can think about, okay, well at this point, why don't you go home? In Akai Ito, you can actually do that, and you can just leave all of the danger behind and just choose to get out of the situation, and that'll take you to a good ending where you decided to get out before things got too crazy. I would say that it does kind of feel repetitive for those very small instances of a couple endings, but a lot of them actually get condensed down to where they don't count as their own specific ending. So there is a decent amount of variance when it comes to 32 different endings and how different kinds of instances will occur, and what kind of events happen to take you to a specific ending. When talking about the actual translation quality, I looked around and I was actually given a little bit of context when it comes to it. I think if you want to hear without any of the fluff, just the definitive answer from me, yes, I would say Akai Ito HD has a very poor translation, but I do think the reason that I want to say that it has a bad translation is different from what other people might be saying. From what other people have been saying, to me it looks like a lot of the emphasis on Akai Ito's translation comes from how faithful is it to the Japanese? Is there some specific wording that's not true to the original text? I don't know, but I think Akai Ito, more than like any other visual novel, does feel like a story that is maybe a little too like in over its head when it comes to how like culturally like dependent its like wording is, if that makes sense. There's a whole lot of like different scenarios where it'll be like, hi, my name is so and so with this type of kanji with like this kind of pronunciation, as in like this specific cultural word. And there are like multiple instances of this to where a lot of like Japanese kind of like folklore kind of stuff is kind of said very like willy-nilly, and if you're somebody that isn't even really remotely in tune with various like Japanese cultural stuff, you're gonna be kind of confused if you like really are paying attention. There is actually a little like dictionary kind of feature within the game to where there are keywords and you can actually go in and look up the definition of said keywords, so in that way it's not actually that big of a deal. But I do think that it like multiple points throughout the story, surprisingly, I will probably put maybe an instance in the background for the video that's playing right now to show that I think at some points though, like Akai Ito does a really solid job of conveying that message and making it to where it is able to translate that very like stilted kind of way of like talking into English. Like I said, I'm not somebody that knows Japanese in any like capacity, but I do think that Akai Ito does a really good job at being able to have very like specific things worded and phrased in a way to where an English audience is able to like actually interpret it quite well. I guess another thing we could talk about as far as translation quality is like, is it true to the actual like original? I think I never really noticed. Maybe if you are somebody that can read Japanese, you might be off put. I don't know if maybe some of the wording is like a little different, but as far as like the actual emotional like tone, it's kind of like a jokey story in a way, despite the fact that this is a game where there's multiple like death endings. But I think also like as far as what we can kind of go into as far as like another topic from when I was deciding, because there are actually two different versions that you can read of Akai Ito, being the official translation, and then there's also a fan patch for the game. I did not read the fan patch because I figured, you know what, I'll go ahead and I'll dive head deep into what was probably going to be maybe a bad time, but I figured I would go ahead and do it just because I had saw a decent amount of stuff. And from like what I actually saw in like one of the messages from somebody in the Steam community was actually what motivated me to stick with the official translation over the fan translation. And I can't really attest to whether this person's claims are entirely true or not, but I can get kind of half of the picture, is that they had said that when they had tried both, they found themselves finding the official translation to be more like emotionally driven and more like, I guess maybe like upbeat or happy and like kind of being more like eccentric, I guess is the word. Whereas the fan translation apparently is quite direct, to where a lot of the maybe energy within the script was like ripped out in exchange for just having very like easy to digest wording, I would say. So like I said, I don't really have too much input that I can put as far as the fan translation, but as far as like the official translation, yes, I do kind of agree that it feels like there was a lot of like, I don't know, I guess energy, and you can kind of feel that energy through the like the actual wording. Now, one last thing I want to talk about, and I think as far as like what I would say is actually, yes, a bad translation, is that there's a lot of typos in this game for some reason. And as you can see it as soon as like you boot up the game and you go to the settings menu. I forget exactly which word it is, but it was like, I don't know, I saw some like typo in the game settings in the first couple of minutes of me booting up the game, and I'm like, oh boy, here we go. It wasn't really setting itself up for like, you know, a good first impression. And I do think at multiple like serious points or like, you know, important points in the story, for some reason the translation will be perfectly fine. But then like when you're in maybe like transitioning periods where you're kind of just like doing laid back things, the quality of the translation starts to dip. And I think a majority of the time it's like very small things of like maybe they say one word with like a different kind of meaning. So like rather than saying like her, they'll say she. And then like sometimes it'll just be like, oh, the first word of the sentence they forgot to type the last letter of the word or the first letter of the word or something like that. But I would imagine it gets to be quite like annoying after a while. For me personally, I was paying a good amount of attention to the actual like text and how accurate it was during the first couple hours of my playthrough, just because I wanted to kind of get that like information. But as I played more and more, I started to kind of ignore it. And I guess maybe if you're somebody that sort of skim reads a fair bit, you're probably not going to be affected by the overall translation quality. But if you're somebody that reads on auto, I imagine you're not going to want to play this game at all. You're going to be just like tweaking out the whole time that you're reading Akai Ito, because you notice every little typo and you're like, oh dude, I don't know. I feel like in some ways too, I'm a little like less angered over the fact of like the quality, because of the fact that this game's actually kind of like a budget title. I believe I bought it on sale for like $7 or $8 off of Steam. So I knew what I was going into when I bought it. So I wasn't like too flustered over the fact, but I would say, you know, it just depends on the person, right? But like overall, I really enjoyed my time with Akai Ito HD. It's a pretty like different kind of experience. The fact that it is this like butterfly effect and you have all the like different branching paths. It's a really fun game to kind of just go ahead and dive into blind and just see where fate takes you, right? It's pretty like energetic. It's not really like a game that like if you wanted to play some sort of like horror title, I wouldn't say Akai Ito HD is a horror title, despite the fact that it could feel like it heavily relies off of blood. It's pretty like easygoing and is a pretty like fun experience overall. Like I said, I really enjoyed my time with Akai Ito HD. It's maybe like it took me like 16 hours. So I would say if you're playing with a walkthrough, you're probably going to burn through the game quite quickly. I think playing through a majority of the time blind is a pretty good way to go about it. And overall, I could see why it's kind of like this cult classic in a way, to where, you know, there is no like H content. It was originally on PlayStation 2, but it kind of like does lean a little bit more heavily into, I'm surprised at how easygoing PlayStation was back in the day, to where if you read a PS2 or a PS3 visual novel, it's a lot less strict as opposed to nowadays. And then just like overall, yeah, I think Akai Ito can be quite a fun visual novel despite all of its flaws, and it's a pretty like budget title for if you want to just pick it up and not spend too much money onto any one game. You can get a decent amount of playtime out of it, and overall, yeah, those have been my thoughts on Akai Ito HD. Thank you guys for watching. I've been Wave, and I will see you next time.